This is Caleb the Mechanic with Radio Free Catholic. We'll go ahead and get started with a prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Sancta Michael Arcangela defende nos in proelio, contra nequitiam et insidias diaboli est praesidium. Imperet illi Deus supplicas deprecamur, tuque princeps militae calestis, Satana maliosque spiritus malignos que ad perditionem animarum pervegantur in mundo, divina virtute in infernum detrude. Amen. Our Lady of Sorrows, pray for us. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So, Catholic fam, I wanted to talk today about the explosion in Beirut, Lebanon. There are some geopolitical factors that kind of add in to what this whole situation actually looks like. I want to start off, we'll go over the basics of what happened directly, some of the rumors and all of that, and then some of the external factors that are involved, and other factors that are not external to Lebanon, but are other factors that are having an effect on the Lebanese people, and specifically the Lebanese people, but also secondarily to the Lebanese government. So the first thing, if you saw the explosion, if you actually watched the video, and there were a tremendous number of video clips, it was very easy to mistake that explosion for a nuclear bomb. It was extremely easy. The compression wave basically pulled all of the moisture out of the air, and that's where you get that cloud, because you have the compression wave, and then you have that area of decompression right behind it. And when you get that decompression area, the water just comes right out and actually makes that fog. It's very common. It's a common effect that generally happens with other disasters, but it's more, I guess, the nicest version of that type of compression wave is actually when you see a jet flying by that breaks the sound barrier, and you get that cloud that seems to streak off of certain parts of a jet. They're saying it was almost 3,000 pounds worth of explosives, which makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. The explosion apparently registered as a 4.3 on the Richter scale. So if you're in California, you're familiar with earthquakes, you know exactly what 4.3 feels like. And I remember living in Southern California actually during a 4.6 earthquake, and yeah, it's startling to say the least. The area destroyed a huge chunk of the city of Beirut. Like that explosion just wiped out a huge chunk of the city of Beirut. 85% of the area that was affected was Christian. This is kind of, on the one hand, obviously, this being a Catholic podcast, obviously the people who were affected in the explosion are in our prayers. And I would hope that they're in yours as well. But in the aftermath of the devastation, there were a lot of homes that were actually just obliterated. They were destroyed. Hezbollah went in the immediate aftermath, going around and actually attempting to purchasing the land and the destroyed homes. This obviously has a tactical implication, because the more area within Lebanon that Hezbollah actively controls, the greater physical control, tactical control that they actually have on the city. There were also reports that the explosion took out a silo that was basically a major food storage area. That may not be true. There may have been food in there, but it's unlikely. And the reason for this, is most of the food that actually came into the port of Beirut was actually being exported into Syria to help prop up the Assad regime in Syria, and that was being done by Hezbollah. The nation. Well, before I get to that, there were also rumors about a fireworks factory being the cause of the explosion. And there's reasonably solid intel that that report is false. It is actually much more likely that this explosion was actually set off on purpose. And if you have any familiarity with the history of Hezbollah, then it's actually very well known that Hezbollah has a tendency to sacrifice its own people in order to be able to achieve whatever military objectives that they're trying to achieve. And this is important. You know, how would they manage to get away with this? Obviously, Hezbollah is not a secondary power in Lebanon. The vast majority of the government is actually just directly members of Hezbollah. So they actually have a controlling majority, and if I remember the stats correctly, it's actually an overwhelming controlling majority of the government that are actually basically all agents of Hezbollah and part of their system. The concussion from that explosion was felt 100 miles away. It is the third or fourth largest non-nuclear explosion in history. This was a very, very big deal. It's important to note that a few days after the explosion, The Hague was supposed to release a verdict talking about the assassination of their prime minister back in 2005. And the prime minister, apparently, I don't remember his name, but he was a very popular person. Everybody in the country liked him, pretty much except for Hezbollah. And when you say except for Hezbollah, you're basically saying except for Iran. Iran wanted control of Lebanon. Lebanon is a tactical and strategic important locate. It is a tactically and strategically important location when you consider that it shares borders with Israel and it shares borders with Syria. Everybody who knows anything about Iran knows that it's basically Iran's constant mantra that they want to destroy Israel. They want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. So having a stronghold just on the other side of the border was extremely tactically and strategically brilliant. However, because of the explosion, that verdict that was supposed to come out of The Hague, which was going to include some sanctions and some direct punishments assigned to the government, delayed, or the explosion delayed the verdict. And so now, instead of getting started on it last week, the verdict should actually be released on the 17th or 18th of August. In the big picture, this means that Hezbollah has some time to clean a few things up, and as long as they don't have a functioning government, because they did dissolve the government, whatever sanctions happen are generally going to be feckless. There's nothing that they could do. They're going to say, hey, we're going to do this and this and this, and what remains of the Lebanese government's going to look and go, well, we don't really have a government right now. We don't have a prime minister. So your sanctions are useless. The side effects on this, as I said, 85% of the affected area, the area affected by the explosion were Christians. The nation, Lebanon, is going through a severe economic depression right now, and it's not actually being helped by Hezbollah. As I said earlier, any food that was actually coming in, most of it was being immediately exported out into Syria. Lebanon has a population of about 4.5 million, and they've also received an additional 1.5 million refugees from the war in Syria. With the country already being in an economic depression, and then having a bunch of refugees come in, economically speaking, Hezbollah is in dire straits. They are horrifyingly overwhelmed with the economic repercussions of the explosion and the infrastructure that was destroyed, but also with the weakness of the Lebanese pound and the lira and the and the 1.5 million refugees. The nation also has been overwhelmed. Their hospital system has been overwhelmed because they also have a very large outbreak of COVID. The people in Lebanon are in an extraordinary bad place. And so it's not actually particularly surprising that there's been rioting in the streets and there have been some 120 some odd people that have been wounded due to conflict with law enforcement. And that's in addition to the 200 dead and some, or excuse me, the 100 and change dead and the 200 and something wounded and at least 300 or more missing due to the explosion. Now, I mentioned before, Hezbollah is actually the main controller of the Lebanese government. And Hezbollah is backed by Iran. Iran has been under its own pressure because the Chinese have they've been working these deals, and the Chinese have this sort of shadow diplomacy thing going with where they'll build infrastructure in a nation, and they'll use that to kind of co-opt and force the government into giving up a whole bunch of economic benefits and a lot of control to China. That has gotten the Iranian people very, very angry at the mullahs, and basically saying, and the people are basically saying that Iran has been sold by the mullahs to China, and China is being allowed to colonize Iran. Now, it's well known that Iran was already an ally of China. In fact, Iran has been allied with Russia and China, and the complaint has been ever increasing about the idea that Iran might end up becoming a Russian colony or later becoming a Chinese colony. And so, with this, whatever this action actually was designed to do, this explosion in Beirut, is likely designed to increase the amount of control that the Iranian regime has over Lebanon, so that they have at least some semblance of strength to be able to operate with. It also will give them a significant, if they can manage to get the system integrated right, thank you God, that it has been nothing but trouble for them trying to get the system integrated right, where Iran and Lebanon could actually begin to sort of operate as a unit together, and thereby make themselves be stronger in the face of the ever-increasing Chinese pressure. And when I say Chinese pressure, China is deploying some 5,000 military forces into Iran for what the U.S. would call security assistance, or foreign military aid. The Iranian government has been in a financial hucklebuck since Trump got elected because he's done nothing but chip away at them with sanctions and more sanctions and locking up all kinds of money and making sure that Iran has not been able to do the same sort of business that they would normally be able to do, specifically because most of the money that they make actually gets redirected for operations like Hezbollah and the backing of institutions like Hamas. Iran obviously is a majorly terrorist regime, and the more money that they're able to generate, the more they're able to keep their economy going, the more they're able to continue to pump money into the military and into their external operations like Hezbollah, like fomenting chaos in Lebanon and applying pressure to Israel, the better off that they are. So the things that the Trump administration has been doing specifically to Iran has put them in a serious financial straits. It's put them in those financial straits to the extent that they've basically invited China in to kind of help prop them up. Now, China is only interested in China. They're only interested in whatever helps the Chinese Communist Party. So they've kind of, in developing this alliance with China, in reality, they've probably actually latched themselves onto a parasite, because China is basically operating to do whatever they can in order to subsume the entire world under the Communist Party. Sucks to be Iran. The Trump administration has put China in a position where they have to be far more aggressive with these things. And up until very, very recently, China was engaged in what they call wolf warrior diplomacy, where they've been very, very aggressive. It would seem that over the next few months, because of the fact that they're in dire economic straits, and they're also suffering with flooding and locusts and drought and all of the normal corruption of communist government coming back to bite them in the butt, because most of their infrastructure has had a lot of the money embezzled from it, and so they've used substandard building materials, and a lot of their infrastructure is now beginning to collapse, including that giant monstrosity at the Three Rivers Gorge. From a strategic standpoint, the way this administration has utilized economic warfare has been nothing short of brilliant. We don't hear anything out of North Korea so much anymore. They've had to kind of close up shop, and with Kim Jong-un getting ill and his sister kind of stepping up to greater prominence, the reality is that it's very clear that making any serious moves just yet is not quite on the docket. But I would still keep an eye on North Korea as well, because obviously North Korea is a proxy of China. The world political scene is made more complex by the fact that each of these regimes actually has very much their own agenda. Russia has been increasing in nationalist fervor. China has never not been basically nationalist, and where they want to export and where they want to increase their control around the world, they want to absolutely make sure that it is a Chinese model. Iran is looking, in much the same way as much of the Muslim world, as I mentioned with Turkey as well, Iran is looking to establish the caliphate and global Islamic rule. Each of these things, early on, when they were all basically allied trying to find a way to subvert the United States and get the United States far enough away from the top of the scene that they could actually operate with more impunity, each of these nations were more than willing to ally with each other, despite the fact that they knew that each one of them actually had their own agenda. However, they've all been put in a position now where their own agenda can no longer be afforded to take second seat to their desire to topple the United States. And when it comes to toppling the United States, they've had help. They're getting help from the European Union, they're getting help from the United Nations, and they're getting help from left-wing super activists like George Soros and the people who've put together like Antifa and Black Lives Matter. The key thing to kind of keep in mind is that when you're dealing with corruption is very short-sighted. So it looks like there's a lot of chaos going on in the world, but if you don't actually know the specific motivators for each of these groups and what it is that their end state goal is, then seeing the way everything's popping out, you look at it and you just kind of go, what's going on? When you know that Iran has its specific agenda and it's willing to partner with China, which has its specific agenda, you know that at some point that their relationship is going to break apart. If it does break apart, that's going to be significantly chaotic, to the tune of probably, a lot of civil unrest at the best, and probably outright international conflict and civil war at the worst. Everything does seem to be boiling over, though. We have our issues going on in the United States in almost 100 cities. We have the World Economic Forum trying to pull off a great reset in the aftermath of COVID-19. We have the Vatican with the Economy Francesco, also now being pushed, which had a climate change agenda to it and is now being pushed because of COVID-19, because apparently viruses are very affected by the climate. And all of these agendas basically all kind of pushing in one general area. And the reason why a lot of these people have been able to be allied, the reason why we have Democratic politicians who were so deep in the pockets of China that it was almost laughable, and Republican politicians as well, because Mitch McConnell will never, ever be outside of my vision based on what he's done in the past. But the reason why everybody was generally okay with heading in that direction was because all of them are also simultaneously vying for being in the top spot. So the American government being at the top of this global government where it's basically operating the whole world, or the Chinese government doing its thing, or the Iranian government and the caliphate, or Turkey and the caliphate, or the European Union trying to, like, everybody's sort of vying, trying to get to this spot where they're establishing the rules for the whole world. Ultimately, usually, particularly when it comes to corruption, they're dealing with it for their own personal gain. When it comes to the individuals involved and everybody heading in that same direction, everybody's looking to get their piece of the pie. The state of the nation and the state of the world at the close of this election will determine how this proceeds. If the Trump administration returns to the executive, particularly with, and most especially if that is also accompanied by sweeping out all of the detritus from the House of Representatives and some of the detritus from the Senate, then what's probably going to happen is much of the world is going to descend into chaos, because they've managed to set all of these systems up right up to the point where all they have to do is flick the domino and all of the dominoes fall, and you get that picture like you did in V for Vendetta. If he's reelected, they're going to try and push it anyway, because the timing is right. But it's going to be much, much more difficult to do so with an administration who's openly opposed to the further globalization of the world. What does that mean, big picture? What's going on in Lebanon may push Iran into acting early. If Iran acts early, China will probably have to act with their plan early as well. If, with those two moving, once that part goes into motion, then you're probably going to see some semblance of a response from Erdogan in Turkey. Once that ball gets rolling, it's going to be a mad dash, and everybody's going to do exactly what it is that they've been trying to do, and they're going to try to, and pretty much it's going to be that moment, because right now they're kind of in a global Mexican standoff, where everybody's looking at to see who's going to make the first move. If Trump gets reelected, somebody's going to have to make the first move on that. And oh, hey, by the way, even if Trump gets elected, we're still going to have to deal with immense amount of civil unrest at home, and then we'll also be dealing with whatever other garbage is going on abroad. If he's not reelected, there's going to be a slightly muted version of that civil unrest, and our economy is going to get forced into the toilet simply because every single one of the politicians on the left have decided that they're going to undo everything that Trump did. What Trump did was specifically to slow down this spread of globalism. It was a reminder that everybody needed to take care of their own nations first. He may have been the thing that caused all of the masks on everybody around the world to come off. China, up until earlier this week, was being openly aggressive. They were talking about going to war with the United States. They were talking about they're on the border of India. There, you've got Pakistan on the other border of India. This was literally a point. This was a pushing point where everyone's about to reach for the cookie to try to grab it so they can get the last one. And when that happens, the strife will be immeasurable. Probably up to the full level as predicted by Our Lady of Fatima. Because we've literally come to the point where we are in the last decade before a grand chastisement. And it may come during this decade or it may come at the close of the decade, but the reality of it is that in America, without a doubt, in America, not later than 2024, we're going to feel something horrifying. And the way everything is set in the world, it looks like over the next 3 to 4 years is going to be, well, I'd say over the next 1 to 2 years is going to be the setup, and it's really going to be on like Donkey Kong come 2022, 2023. What does that look like specifically? I have no idea. I personally have never lived through anything like this, and to be perfectly honest with you, when I try to look at the other examples in history, nothing comes close. There has never been a point where 15 different nations all have a different agenda, and they're all willing to go full on for it. There's never been a point where America has been so successfully subverted that we may descend into full-on civil war. And I got to be perfectly honest with you, if that happens, I've made the correlation between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance. The reality is even the Taliban and the Northern Alliance had their own territory, and then they were vying to take over the other territory. In the United States of America, what would be the conservative territory? What would be the God-fearing territory? There are God-fearing people in Spokane, Washington. There are God-fearing people in Seattle, Washington. There's also left-wing nut jobs in Seattle, Washington. Does that mean that the state of Washington is going to split where it's the coast versus the rest of the state? And who's going to get rid of the coast? Who's going to allow the resources that are the coastal cities? Because you have to remember, coastal cities have docks. Coastal cities have shipping lanes. Coastal cities have serious infrastructure that actually seriously aid in the support of the rest of the nation. Are we just going to write those off? Is somebody actually going to write off New York Harbor? Could you really see people doing that? Even if New York City is in full-on leftist anarchist control, who's going to let it go? The harbor is still vital. It's vital infrastructure. Who's going to let go of California? Why would we abandon some of the most beautiful land to just total destruction and chaos? Now, maybe if you live in Nebraska, you might not care about what happens in California. But I can guarantee you that the San Fernando Valley is going to care. That Orange County is going to care about whether or not LA turns into a completely different nation. And Los Angeles is not completely gone to the leftists either. The reality is that it's a very thin margin between left and right, even in the blue states, where it's literally pockets and sections. Case in point, the state of Virginia. Alexandria and Richmond both managed to be blue enough that they usurped total control of the state legislature. But that's just Alexandria and Richmond. What about the rest of the state? Are they really going to surrender? Could you really see yourself doing that? To put it in greater perspective, it would be as though the husband and the wife have decided to fight each other for total control of the house. They both share the master bedroom. They're both fighting over the kids. But splitting the house? Nobody splits the house. You leave the house and you sell it in a divorce. Well, what if that wasn't an option? That's what's on our plates for what's coming ahead. And the decisions that we make are going to have a drastic effect on those. So it's not necessarily all doom and gloom, but it's certainly not going to be all sunshine and lollipops, and it's not going to be even as clean as it was in the U.S. Civil War. It's going to be insurrection in the streets. It's going to be fighting in the cities, resistance in the country. And it's going to be like that, potentially, around the world. Very few nations will be lucky enough to go army versus army if this comes out to the worst possible scenario. And that's actually what sounds like a great chastisement to me. Because while war is a chastisement, it's nothing compared to brother against brother around the world. That's what we're looking at. That's Beirut and Lebanon and Iran and how they play. And what's going to be the portions of the global game that they are going to have an effect on. Man, these are depressing. Whew. Anyway, this is Caleb the Mechanic with Radio Free Catholic. Before I go, I want to remind you, please like, share, subscribe. Especially share. The more people who hear about this, this might actually help some people. Get a better picture on what's going on in the whole world. Also, there is the ability to actually contribute directly to the podcast. You can contribute on anchor.fm. There's a button that you can hit if you want to subscribe for a monthly or a one-time donation or something like that. Any help you can give would be greatly appreciated. And with that, I'm Caleb the Mechanic with Radio Free Catholic. May God bless you and the Virgin protect you. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Okay, this is Caleb the Mechanic with a part 2 to the episode on the Beirut explosion. There was some breaking news with the United Arab Emirates and Israel managing to strike a deal where they're going to begin normalizing their diplomatic relations. This is being added to it because the UAE is actually a significant partner in the Middle East. And given what happened in Beirut, I don't believe that these two items should be taken in isolation from each other. So, in the previous segment, talked about the Beirut explosion and how that probably actually has a significance when it comes to the government of Iran. I mentioned the possibility that the explosion was actually deliberate. I mentioned the possibility that it was actually deliberately done by Hezbollah, and if it was done by Hezbollah, then it was probably done via proxy with Iran. I mentioned that Iran was under pressure within its own borders due to the increasing Chinese influence and control, and the fact that they cannot afford to lose control of Lebanon. Now, it's generally understood by anybody who's tracking these that Iran has every intention of establishing a global caliphate, beginning with the destruction of Israel, hence the issue with Lebanon, and trying to basically conquer at least all of the Middle East, and then eventually push Islamic law under the caliphate around the world. This development with the UAE and Israel is significant because if diplomatic relations can normalize, that actually opens the door for further normalized relations with Saudi Arabia and Jordan. The UAE, though it's a very small country, in fact, actually, if you look it up on the map, it's actually, I think, roughly the same size as Kuwait. It is, however, one of the most stable Arab nations. It is one of the most stable Muslim nations in the region. Egypt just went through a whole rigmarole. Tunisia just went through a whole rigmarole, and there's still a lot of tension and instability in both of those two nations. Libya is, in addition to this, and everybody knows that Yemen is also a training ground for terrorists because it's an extraordinarily broken governmental society. With all of that unrest, and then taken into account the fact that Lebanon just got thrown back at least a decade at least a decade, if not further, due to the explosion in Beirut. And given the fact that Syria is not particularly stable and that Turkey is also moving to make things further unstable, what's looking like is emerging is probably something to the effect of competing interests between Turkey and Iran, and then added to that the fact that it seems, by all accounts, that at least the UAE, Qatar, possibly Qatar. There's a lot to go with. There's a lot to go with that one. But at least the UAE and Saudi Arabia seem to have a desire to have zero tie-in to what Iran's doing, and I don't know where they stand particularly with Turkey. I do know that Turkey's got a whole bunch of other issues that it's looking at. Obviously, it's got interests in Syria. It's got further interests in Iraq. And so what it looks like at first glance, without doing any further study, and I'm going to have to, and I will look into relations between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey so I can get a better picture of what's going on. But what it looks like is there are three competing interests in the Middle East in the Muslim side of the conflict. Obviously, then you have Israel and you have Israel and by extension the United States, who has an interest in making sure that everything stays as stable over there as humanly possible, so that this way we can get some semblance of cooperation between nations. This move with the UAE and Israel is huge. All right. Jordan is already kind of lukewarm when it comes to Israel. I mean, there's a wide variance within Jordan. There are some who would like to see the destruction of Israel. There are others who are just like, man, screw it. Let's just coexist. With this move by the United Arab Emirates, that opens a door for cooperation with Qatar and Kuwait, as well as further cooperation with the Jordan. The UAE, as far as I know, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are on fairly good speaking terms because of the fact that from a heritage standpoint, they're actually very similar. They're all obviously on the Arabian Peninsula, and they've got clearly two different governments. But as far as I know, there's not any open conflict between the two of them. If diplomatic relations can be normalized with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Jordan, with Israel, this will go a very long way towards stalling the advance of Iran. In particular, if the diplomatic relations normalize enough to where the UAE and Israel contemplate an alliance, something that would be mutually beneficial to the two of them, this pretty much would help stop Iran in its tracks. They'll continue to push, but the reality of the situation is they don't have the economy that the United Arab Emirates does. So they don't really have the pushing power. The United Arab Emirates also has a very modern military. We actually are the greatest proponent. We actually are the greatest supplier of their weapon systems, with France coming in at number 2 and Russia coming in at number 3. That is a big deal. That is a very big deal. Given France's ties with the UAE, that means that this actually it's not an immediate strong effect. What it is it's actually the ripple effect. Like throwing a stone in a lake, the ripples will eventually reach out, and this effect will eventually make its way out pretty much to all of the Western powers. This is a really, really big deal. It can potentially allow us to make legitimate moves towards peace in the Middle East. And if we can get to that point, I think that would stave off one portion of the conflict. As you know, given what's going on with what happened in Beirut and the fact that there's a very high likelihood, if this explosion was done deliberately, then it was done with at least it was done at a minimum. If it was done deliberately, then it was done by Hezbollah with a minimum of a solid consent from the Iranian government. If not, then all of this is actually just lost conjecture. Admittedly, I don't have access to the information that I used to, but I've got enough experience with the way these things kind of move to be able to actually kind of dial in and get an image of what's going on. I cannot understate the positive effect of this normalizing of diplomatic relations between the UAE and Israel. This can, over time, actually develop into more of an alliance. And if it gets to that point, despite the incompatibilities of the two types of government, that would go a very, very long way. Peaceful coexistence is a very difficult thing to do, particularly when your worldviews are diametrically opposed in the way that the Israeli worldview and the typically Muslim Arab worldview are. But this can be hugely beneficial, at least in the midterm. In the short term, it's going to take a little while. They're going to have a lot of things that they have to work out. This may take another 5 to 10 years to work out. However, given the pace of the way things are moving, I would not be surprised if you could dial that timeline into between 3 and 5 years where they really actually start to make moves. And as I said, if Jordan gets involved and Saudi Arabia get involved, then it's going to be faster still, because there are enough interests that are at least co-aligned with stopping the aggression coming out of Iran. That is a really big deal. It makes me very, very happy that this is coming to pass. Now, the more pessimistic side of the analysis is this could be a feint. The issue that I have with the economically developed Muslim nations is that there's not enough really known about the nature of the way that they run their government with their own citizens. As we well know, a lot of the major terrorists have come out of some of these big, well-developed nations, using the fact because a lot of these well-developed nations have very robust social programs. And so while on paper, the unemployment rate in the United Arab Emirates might only be, and it is on paper, last year's unemployment rate was 1.6%. The thing is that the majority of the workforce, 87% of their workforce, are expats from other countries who are basically labor imports. That means that while most of the people will be employed, the people who are not employed are usually the actual citizens themselves. This is the case in Saudi Arabia, where you get the children of wealthy families who don't actually have anything to do, and so they kind of jump off into Muslim extremism and carry the jihad forward. This may be the case also with the United Arab Emirates. However, in the last 20 years, I have not been able to find anything to track back to the UAE, and I have served multiple times with alongside the United Arab Emirates. I served with them in Kosovo in 2000. I served with them 3 times for 3 years in Afghanistan. They are very well trained, well disciplined, and amazingly professional soldiers. It was an absolute, once we got past the language barrier and all that, it was an absolute pleasure to work with them. Their soldiers are excellent soldiers. The question is, how much of that actually carries over? If I remember correctly, I was looking at the CIA World Factbook, and I believe that military service in the UAE is mandatory for Arabs. If I remember correctly, it's mandatory for Arabs to serve at least a certain period of time between the ages of 18 and 24, and then women are allowed to volunteer for up to 9 months in military service. I cannot tell you how important it is that fact is in play. Most of the Muslim nations do not let women in their militaries. Now, there are some people who have figureheads, like the Afghan military has women in the military, but for the most part, they're figureheads, and they don't actually have actual command authority. At least they didn't when I was over there. However, the women who are in the military in Afghanistan are almost like pop culture icons. Like they are very, very prominent and popular in Afghanistan. So there's kind of a mix. It's kind of a mixed bag. It's really, really hard to tell when you're really trying to peel apart and actually dive in to what the culture's like, to really kind of get a sense of how oh Lord, I hate using this word, of how progressive the government is. But the fact that the UAE allows women to volunteer in their military, that is significant. It's very significant. It means that there's going to be, no matter what, there's always going to be an undercurrent of patriotism across the country. So what that dials out to, patriots can be kind of very, that can be a double-edged sword, because somebody can be a patriot for their nation and push their nation to war because they honestly believe that's the right thing to do. But the way the government seems to be set up and the way everything seems to be, it looks like the United Arab Emirates might be one of the most perfect potential allies with Israel. They're already one of our allies, and as I said before, it's with good reason. These guys are actually very, very awesome people, particularly when taken against the backdrop of some of the total atrocities that have a tendency to come out of the Muslim world. There's a good reason to have some hope for some bit of stabilization in the region. As I said, though, this legit could be a trick. This could actually be something that's taken advantage of, because as diplomatic relations normalize, bad people can take advantage of the now lowered guard of the allies. Just kind of adding this to the picture, as I said, you cannot take the Beirut explosion independent of this major breakthrough in the news. So keep all of that in mind. This is Caleb the Mechanic with Radio Free Catholic. May God bless you and the Virgin protect you. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.